Hello, and welcome to a multi-part history of organized sport. So often we find that our histories start with the Greeks, if only because they were the first to be considerate enough to write things down. From cave paintings we have evidence of some early athletic events being competed perhaps. In the Epic of Gilgamesh there is mention of wrestling. In the ancient Egyptian festival of Hebeside there were sometimes competitions in running and rowing and such like. The Hebeside is our first evidence of any sort of organized competition, but only took place during pharaonic jubilees, and hence centuries could go by without one being held, and they were not solely athletic festivals. At other times there seemed to have been no organized competitions, but only occasional casual events. During the civilization of Minoan Crete, archaeology shows evidence of archery, acrobatics and various bull-related sports. Homer had Bronze Age Greeks competing in the later events of the Olympic period, but there is some debate as to whether this is anachronistic. These games seem to have typically been funeral games, and the major games of the later period were frequently claimed to have originated as games commemorating a death. In classical Greece there were many games, both with and without prize money. The first to be founded, and always the greatest, was the Olympic Games, held at Olympia in the territory of the minor city-state of Elis in the Peloponnese. The games were mostly centered in the Peloponnesian territory occupied by the Greek peoples known as Dorians. The first Olympics was held in 776 BC, by our calendar, and originally consisted of a single foot race. It was meant to honor Pelops, the hero after whom the Peloponnese is supposedly named, who won a victory in a chariot race over King Oinamos. Oinamos had challenged anyone to beat him in such a race, and would reward a winner with his daughter and his crown, and a loser with death. Pelops won, albeit through sabotage, and the Olympics was to remember that event. The later games had similar origins. The Pythian Games, held by the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, was named in honor of the rotting corpse of one of Apollo's victims, either a robber or a monster. The Isthmian Games were founded in honor of a child who had been chased off a cliff and had washed up on the shore nearby, and also somehow in honor of Theseus. Not to be outdone by Isthmia, the Nemean Games were both in honor of one of the 7 against Thebes who had died, and in honor of the Nemean lion and its death at the hands of Heracles. These were the 4 main events, each without monetary prizes but with the greater prize of glory. The Olympic Games were the oldest and greatest, followed by the Pythian Games, which were also held quadrennially, 2 years after the preceding Olympics. The Nemean and Isthmian Games were lesser, and were held every 2 years in the years when the Pythian and Olympic Games weren't being held. Years, that it, in the ancient reckoning, wherein the year started and ended at the summer solstice. In the modern calendar the Isthmian Games were held earlier in the same year as the Olympic and Pythian Games, and the Nemean Games in the autumn of the preceding year. These were the Stephanitic, or crown, games. In each of these the only prize was a crown of laurels, or of pine or dry celery, depending on venue. In addition to these games were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Keremetitic, or money, games, such as the Panathenaic Games. Athens held these quadrennially, as well as holding a local games each year. The prizes at the Panathenaic Games were very large, and were awarded to people finishing as low as 5th in an event. Prizes were typically paid in the form of large quantities of olive oil, awarded in special amphorae at the Panathenaic Games. There were enough events, and the prizes were large enough, that there could be professional athletes and people who made their living off those athletes. Trainers, sculptors, ode writers. The greatest athletes of antiquity could boast of dozens of victors at the Crown Games, of which 6 were held in 4 years, and sometimes well over 1,000 victories in the Money Games. Although the greatest glory accrued to the winner of the sprint, after whom the Olympiad would be named, the greatest prize money at the Money Games would go to the winner of the Tethrypon, or 4-horse chariot race, or to the winner of the musical events. The events were separated into three categories, in translation known as the naked games, the horse games and the musical games. At Olympia there were no musical games, other than the opening events, which would be for a herald and a trumpet blower. The winners of these events would then serve as a tannoy system for the remainder of the Olympic festival. The main events were the naked games, or gymnakozagon. They consisted of a sprint of almost 200 modern meters, a double-length sprint, a longer run of 5 to 10,000 meters, a run in armor, a pentathlon and the fighting events of boxing, wrestling and the pankration, meaning all fighting. The horse events, or hippikozagon, were centered around the 2- and 4-horse chariot races, although there was also a horse race. This program was not consistent. There was a brief experiment with mule cart racing. The race in armor was a late addition. For the first several Olympiads there were no events at all other than the stadium sprint. In one late Olympiad the Roman Emperor Nero, now controlling Greece, even made the Olympians hold a musical competition, which they normally disdained. The other crown games held similar programs. The race in armor was of a different length in different places, and even the other races weren't exactly the same length at different sites as there were no standard measures. The Pythian games, and sometimes the others, also held musical games. Competitions were held in the playing of the flute and the kythera, in singing and dancing, in acting and poetry. The winner of the Pythian flute competition would accompany the long jumpers in the Olympic pentathlon. There were also separate categories for boys and men, and frequently a third category for beardless youths. A panel of judges ran each competition and would assign competitors to their age categories at the start of the events. They would also act as referees and judge any events settled by subjective criteria, such as the poetry and the Olympic trumpeter, or salpinx. There are records of boys have nightmares about being made to compete against men. There were also occasionally female competitors, although not in the main events. At Olympia there was a separate competition for women called the Heraea. In the Pythian games there were occasional female competitors in the mousikozagon, and they seem to have done particularly well in the poetry. Women, as well as corporate entities such as city-states, could also compete in the hippikozagon, and would compete especially in the chariot race. One Spartan woman, called Kiniska, was asked to compete by her brothers specifically to prove that only money mattered to winning the chariot race. She won, and although she was not allowed to attend as a spectator, she was granted the normal honor of victors, that she was allowed to set up a statue of herself at the stadium. On the base of her statue she had made the following inscription: "Kings of Sparta were my father and brothers." Kiniska, victorious at the chariot race with her swift-footed horses, erected this statue. I assert that I am the only woman in all Greece who won this crown. Women also had a Heraea at Argos, and of course competitions in the feminine arts of housekeeping, sobriety and beauty. I'm not aware of the criteria for judging a sobriety competition. Sometimes events other than the horse events could be performed by proxy, as when Dionysus, tyrant of Syracuse, hired professional rhapsodes to perform in his stead. Women were normally unable to win in the naked events, but dead men could. Oratian's third pankration victory, for example, came as he died. He was being strangled to death but broke his opponent's foot to escape the stranglehold. It was too late for him to live, but his opponent was put in so much pain that he submitted before Oricon was seen to be dead. That took place at Olympia. The boxer Maxineus competed in the final of the naming games against Cugas. The fight went on long enough that it ended in the ancient equivalent of a penalty shootout. They agreed to stand and trade punches, fist for fist, until one was defeated. Maxineus used his first hit to rip out his opponent's entrails and was disqualified, allowing the dead Cugas to be awarded the laurels. He wasn't disqualified because he had killed, but because it was an open-handed strike and therefore was counted as one strike with each fingertip, and therefore cheating. Cleomenes of Astypalaea was also disqualified from the boxing, this time at the Olympics, for killing an opponent with a foul blow. He went home, went insane, and then went into the nearest school and pulled down the roof, killing dozens of children. He fled to the temple of Athena, where he disappeared, never to be seen again. When the oracle at Delphi was consulted, it told the natives they should worship Cleomenes as a god, as he had ceased to be a mortal. Our unique glory, to become a god by killing a boxer and school full of children. Don't try this at home. Disqualification wasn't the normal punishment for breaking the rules, which would be whipping by the judges, but disqualification was obviously better when one participant was decisively eliminated, such as being dead. A greater glory was claimed by Alcibiades, although he should never have been allowed to compete. The Olympic judges were meant to make sure competitors weren't accused of sacrilege and weren't exiles from their homeland. Alcibiades had been chased from his homeland of Athens after being accused, almost certainly wrongly, of desecrating idols. The natives had still put him in charge of the army for the invasion of Sicily, before recalling him before he got there. He took the opportunity to flee to a colony of Sparta and thence to Sparta itself. Eventually he was exiled from Sparta for having an affair with the wife of one of their kings. Needing to get back in favor at Athens, he entered several teams in the Tethrypon and won first, second and fourth places. This broke a string of 7 Spartan victories in 8 years and won Alcibiades enough favor to return to Athens in triumph and lead them in the war once again. For a while, until driven into exile again. This shows the importance of neutrality in the Hellenic Games. All the crown games were meant to carry a truce to allow people to attend them in peace. The Olympian Games were entirely neutral, yet Elis, which owned the territory, wasn't. Still, their affiliation with the Delian League didn't stop the Spartans from coming to compete. On one occasion a neighboring state even grabbed Olympia itself, only to be driven out by a battle during the games themselves. The Pythian Games benefited from being held by the shrine at Delphi, but they still had to be reclaimed from a neighboring state by Philip of Macedon, acting on behalf of the Amphicynic Council, which administered the site, and which Philip effectively controlled. Unlike the modern Olympics, their ancient equivalent were held no matter what. While the 300 were fighting the Persians, the Olympics were being prepared. After the Battle of Plataea, where the Persians were finally defeated, much of the spoil was sent to Olympia, to join the great statue of Zeus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the world, as a decoration of the site. Athens lay in ashes, but her athletes competed at Olympia all the same. Democracies tended to do well in the egalitarian environment of the Naked Games. One of the first democracies, the Dorian colony of Croton in Italy, dominated the Olympic Naked Games for a century before Athens became a democracy. Beyond their egalitarian ways, the Crotoniates had no obvious claims to fame, except their tremendous Olympic record. And, perhaps, the disdain they held for their athletes who left their home city to represent other cities for money. Syracuse was especially fond of poaching foreign athletes for themselves. Most states would provide for their Olympic victors, as there was no prize at the games themselves. At Athens and many other cities, there was a free meal a day for the rest of your life for each Olympic victory. This practice continued into the period of Roman imperial dominance. Several things stand out as odd about all this to the modern eye. The dedication of each event to a pagan god is odd. The odd practice of tying the foreskin closed during races is odd. Obviously there is also the nudity. Supposedly the nudity started when an athlete won when after his loincloth fell off. Another oddity is the lack of ball gums. This is not because they hadn't been invented, although balls consisting of inflated bladders or leather stuffed with dog hair must have been harder to come by, as depictions of ball games appear throughout history. Even the ancient Egyptians had something that looks like field hockey, while the Greeks had not only that but several other ball games, including an odd one involving sitting on each other's shoulders. The Spartans, with their episkairos and platonistas seem to have had more team sports than most, as well as having longer range races in armor and a race longer than the dolichos, which was the longest at Olympia. Unfortunately, these events ultimately became extinct. It may have been the institutionalization of Christianity which put the final nail in the coffin, but the events were in their death throes long before. As early as the 1st century, an Olympiad was cancelled, other than the boys' events, because of lack of funds. The Romans never really took to Greek athletics, although a few games were held in Rome and occasionally emperors would try to grab glory by staging, founding or competing in games. The Nemean and Isthmian games were the first of the crown games to have serious trouble. The site of the Nemean games seems to have been destroyed in the Peloponnesian Wars, and thereafter they were held in Argos, which administered the site. At least once there were even 2 Nemean games held at once, one at Argos and one at Nemea. Something similar happened when the Isthmian games were moved to Corinth, although eventually Corinth was destroyed by the Romans and the Sicanians took over the Isthmian games. The site of the games was then ransacked to build a wall across the isthmus for defensive purposes. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was also destroyed by raiders during the Hellenistic period and scrapped by the Gauls. The Hellenistic period also suffered a decline of population in the Greek world, great inflation in the Eastern Mediterranean economy, and the end of independence of the Greek city-states in the face of the Romans, the Hellenistic empires and the Achaean and Aetolian leagues, which were unions of Greek states. But of course the Romans had their own sports and sporting events, and we'll get on to the gladiators and the dems next time.